Attention cloud professionals. Secure your seat for Gartner IT Infrastructure, Operations, and Cloud Strategies Conference 2024 on December 10th through 12th in Las Vegas. Discover how AI and cloud innovations are transforming the industry. Learn from top experts, share best practices, and connect with over 5,000 of your peers. Don't miss this opportunity to stay ahead of the fast-evolving world of cloud computing. Register now at gartner.com/us/IO. That's gartner.com/us/IO.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Another Sunday perspective, weekend perspective. We are closing in on the end of September 2024. So getting into what is going to be the last quarter of the year. So we've made it 3/4 of the way. We're getting ready to be into the last quarter of the year. And I'm going to use the first couple minutes here before we jump into the actual topic after the break to, I guess, sort of make a request. So while this show goes out all over the world, you guys mostly know, as we mentioned in the top of the show all the time, Aaron and I are in North Carolina, and we are in the southeast part of the United States. And if you've been following it all, which some of you may and some of you might not, because there's always lots of things going on in the world, we had over the last 3 or 4 days just a absolutely huge hurricane come through the southeast part of the United States. Came in around Florida, which many of you know where Florida is because you know where Disney World is. Sort of came up through there and then just sort of went north. And so it went through states like Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, other areas. The reason I mention this is because while we do get lots and lots of hurricanes this time of year, and it's a pretty regular thing, and there's always, a certain amount of storm-related things that happen, damage and so forth. This one was pretty catastrophic. It was probably one of the largest storms that we've had in they say about 100 years. The amount of water that came with the storm was catastrophic. So I mentioned this because in parts of North Carolina, the western part of the state where Aaron and I don't necessarily live, but are, we've got friends and family in that area. They got somewhere around 45 inches of rain in 3 days. And so you can imagine just that amount of rain by itself can be devastating. And then you mentioned, you marry that with rivers and bridges and infrastructure and so forth that is not prepared to handle that, and you have catastrophic devastation. We have parts of North Carolina that let me just put this in perspective. They have literally said the western part of North Carolina, do not visit, do not go to. You can't get to it. The roads are gone. So anyways, the reason I mention all this is if you, if you are interested, if you have an ability to, they are going to need tons and tons of help. And so I put a couple of links in the show notes to the Red Cross for Western North Carolina. They are going to need funding for things like food and shelter and, all sorts of things, not to do, repairs of people's homes or anything, materialistic like that, but literally to get people out of areas in which there are no longer any roads to pass. Entire towns were washed away in floods. There are people who are stranded on top of mountains and other types of things like that. So anyways, if you get a chance, that would be great. If you give a few dollars, if this is an area of the world that you visited or you have any interest in, or you just feel like, hey, I want to do something good, a few bucks towards the Red Cross of Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee, where they probably had the greatest amount of damage, would be greatly appreciated. And I will get to the topic of today right after the break. And we're back. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And, I didn't really have much of an intro for the show in the first part because I was asking you all to be kind, or at least to be aware of a situation here in North Carolina where Aaron and I live. But I wanted to talk about something that I thought was sort of interesting over the last week or so. It's a little bit egotistical, but that's a little bit of what our industry is sometimes. There was a couple of things that jumped out at me that I thought were sort of interesting and also, just kind of curious as to sort of how we frame things in the tech industry. And essentially, the two things that jumped out at me was, first and foremost, about a week or so ago, there was an interesting little website that popped up called the LinkedIn Profile Roaster. So in essence, somebody had created a website. You could put in anybody's LinkedIn profile. I could put in mine. I could put in Aaron's. I could put in anybody's profile. And somebody had essentially created a custom GPT, right? So if you've used something like ChatGPT before, you are able to build what they call now like custom GPTs. I don't know if they were doing it specifically on ChatGPT or on one of the other tools, but in essence, you can create like a custom profile that says, hey, for any sort of input that I give, please provide all the outputs in this context, right? So for example, in this one, essentially they said, when anybody feeds you a URL that's going to likely be a LinkedIn URL, I want you to go in and give me a sarcastic interpretation of this person's LinkedIn profile, of their career. And so we had some fun with that. And I'll explain why we kind of are going into that. And it was kind of a good way of looking at really anybody, friends, colleagues, people in the industry that we know, people in the industry that we're aware of because of headlines and news, and just sort of, see how if you're a little bit sarcastic or you're just a little bit less starstruck than we oftentimes are, looking at people's profile and how they represent themselves, the words they use to represent themselves, their accomplishments, or just their day-to-day activities. So I'm going to kind of get into that in a second. And then the thing that I thought was sort of interesting from a contrast perspective was, and we're going to cover this in Cloud News of the Week coming up here. Brendan and Aaron and I, Brandon and Aaron and I are going to kind of do our normal Cloud News of the Month coming up. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is OpenAI. And OpenAI, as many of you know, we've covered it quite a bit over the last couple of years, began as what was called a non-for-profit company, a not-for-profit company. So their work, because it was potentially so impactful to humankind, to mankind, they didn't necessarily, at least when it was initially created, they didn't necessarily want to create it as a for-profit company because that could create, adverse priorities from, what their goal was, which was to, sort of harness this powerful technology for the good of mankind. But if it was being done under the auspices of trying to be, a for-profit company, they might create decisions that were less focused on the goodness of humankind and more focused on just sort of profitability and so forth. But anyways, so that's how the company got started. And if you followed along on this show or on lots of other things over the last couple of years, the shift of the company has moved from being a nonprofit to a for-profit. And Sam Altman, who is the CEO, has sort of famously always said, I don't have any equity in the company, even though I run the company, which is a very interesting and unusual situation in which we rarely ever see a leader of a company not have any stake in the future of the company. But anyways, over the last year, they had created a for-profit element to the company, but it was still sort of guided by the nonprofit board. And then this past week, there was an article written about how OpenAI is trying to completely restructure the business to be for-profit first and foremost. They would still have a nonprofit piece of the company. There would be some nonprofit element to the board, but they were primarily moving to be a for-profit company. And then they proceed to go on and talk about how they were going to, give Mr. Altman a large chunk of equity, 7 or 8% of the company, in exchange for running the company, right? And so how much equity was given is not really, material here or there. It was a lot of money because the company potentially is worth a lot of money. But what was interesting was that everything about the company was, at least around this, was written about one person, was written about Sam Altman, was written about the CEO of the company, not the capabilities that the company had created, not the hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people at this point who work for OpenAI. No mention of the fact that 3 or 4 of the original founders have all left for various reasons over the last year, probably basically a year from the sort of semi-coup that happened last year at Thanksgiving to the CTO leaving this past week. Nothing was written about those people. Not one word was mentioned about anybody else in the company for that matter. The entire thing was written about Sam Altman, essentially written about the CEO of the company. And so it got me thinking, between, our industry, we have this fascination with heroes, with sort of, fascination with founders and fascination with the leaders of the company. We talk a lot about, how much money CEOs make. We talk a lot about CEOs executing and creating strategy for good or for bad. We talk a lot about rock stars, right? And this is sort of parodied to a certain extent by Workday has a commercial campaign these days talking about rock stars and how everybody's a rock star because they use their technology. But we are fascinated in our industry with sort of the idea that these companies, whether they have 100 people or 100,000 people, are basically just a representation of one person. They're representation of the singular leader, of the person who makes all the decisions, does all the execution. And I mention this just because as I was going through a bunch of people just having some fun, running their LinkedIn profile through the roaster machine, how easy it would be to look at the profiles of people, from, I'll take myself and I put a link to mine in there. You can take a look at it, but, look at different people. I looked at everybody from people like Andy Jassy and Pat Gelsinger, who, had a harder time roasting because they said, oh, well, you have a big title. You apparently have accomplished some things. But then I looked at some other people and I'll kind of highlight them in a second. And if you read through them, and these are people that we respect, people that we would typically say, boy, that person seems to have accomplished a lot. They are responsible for a lot of things. From a sarcasm perspective, the system, and, as an outsider, you might look at this and go, they're just a cog in the wheel. I mean, they're just a cog in the machine. They just, they do what they do. They're not that important. They're not the person, right? If we put this in the context of, sort of famously Ricky Bobby from the Will Ferrell movie, if you're not first, you're last. And so it got me kind of thinking, do we have this idea in our industry? In essence, do we have this huge dichotomy that the 1%, the less than 1%, are the tech heroes? The people who are the founder of the company or run the company are important. They're the heroes of the story. And everybody else is just sort of imposters. The rest of us are just kind of, we play a role, but it's not a role that needs any sort of recognition. It's just sort of, played during the credits at the end of the movie when you're probably getting up to get out to leave. And so I thought it was sort of funny to sort of read through these. I'll read a little bit from mine, and again, I put a link to it. Mine says, this guy claims he's hanging out somewhere between new technologies and new business models. Oh, please, you're not standing on the frontier of innovation. You're just trying to impress people by connecting some abstract dots. And I read this and I sort of went, God, I guess maybe you're right. That's sort of what we do at the Weekend Perspective. I'm just some random person trying to impress people by connecting some abstract dots. Then it goes on to say, my list of specialties is longer than an actual career timeline. Seriously, dude, save some of the buzzwords for everybody else. You've got more specialties than Starbucks in Seattle. And, I think this, well, it made me laugh a little bit. It is something that so many of us do because the system that we work in technology, whether you're, part of the side of the house that makes stuff and tries to sell stuff, or whether you are, a software engineer, working in the industry and trying to make sure that your resume is up to date and that, you're working on things that are, going to be marketable if for some reason your company, decides that they don't need you anymore, or you decide you want to go somewhere else. We have a tendency to sort of, project ourselves in a bigger light. And in some cases, we do this because we're trying to highlight that, hey, we're capable of a lot of things. We've learned a lot of things. We've taken on many, many different tasks in what we do. And for a lot of people in technology, you do wear a lot of hats, right? You wear the hat of a technologist. You wear the hat of, you could be architecting things. You could be, part of a team that's building things. You might be leading that team that's building things. Maybe your job is to, be a great communicator of what, what you're trying to do, because you realize that not everybody is at the same technical level. And in some cases, you've got to speak to people wearing t-shirts and hoodies. In other cases, you're talking to people wearing suits and ties that only care about spreadsheets and bottom lines and so forth. And, I think a lot of us, do tend to represent ourselves in many ways, but that's, because of the world we live in. But when we run it through the roaster and we sort of, look at it from that perspective, it can be a little bit humbling. It can be a little bit of like, hey, are we projecting too much, or what do we actually do? So I went beyond mine, and I've got a few, like I said, I've got a few nuggets about mine in there. And you're welcome to go in there and look at it and make some fun of it. I'm happy to do that. So then I looked at somebody like Scott Guthrie, who is the executive vice president of Microsoft Cloud. Scott's the guy who, if you follow along, any of the Microsoft events, he's always the guy who comes out in the red shirt. Highly respected guy, highly visible person, does a lot at Microsoft. But, when we ran it through the thing, they said, just being a regular vice president didn't quite capture his essence of corporate boredom. His profile summary is longer than a CVS receipt and just as riveting. He's managed teams that built the .NET framework, Silverlight, and parts of Visual Studio. For the non-nerds out there, that's the equivalent of saying, I managed to build a doomsday vault of software nobody asked for. And again, you have to sort of laugh at it a little bit, but you realize that's how a lot of our industry tends to perceive a good chunk of the people, 80%, 90%, 95%. They sort of are there. They do a bunch of things. They write a bunch of words down. We're not exactly sure what those words mean. And they're not the leader. They don't necessarily own everything. They're not there to sort of fix everything. They don't have ultimate responsibility. And so, it does make us sort of wonder, what is the perception of what a lot of people do in technology? Is it perceived as being valuable? I know for myself, having worked in large companies and small companies, while you may not always understand what your colleagues do, while you may not always necessarily understand why we're doing those things, you kind of go, boy, why are we spending money over there? Why do we have that team? You do realize sometimes if you go to a smaller organization, you're like, man, I really wish we had a group of people that were doing this function, going out and understanding what our customers do so that when the things that we want to build has good feedback channels in it, right? I wish we had people that were, building interesting, marketing collateral, because otherwise, if we go into a business opportunity, we look less than professional, right? But, if you were to look at the resumes or the LinkedIn profiles of some of the people that maybe do that kind of work, it's going to come across as fluffy, right? Maybe you're the person who writes the code, but it's driver code. It's sort of code that lives under the covers. And so how do you represent that? And do people respect what that is? If you're not the lead architect of the number one product and the number one project that's $1 billion market opportunity and so forth, do we have great respect for that? And so, kind of read through that. You can easily go and plug Scott's in and sort of see the full thing. And then I took somebody who, we have much great respect for, one of our friends over on Software Defined Talk. I took Matt Ray's. I could have taken Brandon's. I probably should have taken Brandon's. I grabbed Matt's because it was there. And his is one I thought was sort of interesting because Matt is somebody who, we have a lot of respect for Matt. Matt is a very, very technical person. I thought, okay, I've grabbed a sort of marketing-ish person like myself. I've grabbed an executive like Scott. Let me take somebody who I think the world would typically perceive as being a very, very technical person, a very capable technical person, has, been part of, not only building things, but, starting small companies and, part of growing open source communities, which is a difficult thing. And I said, let me plug Matt's in just for fun, just so I've got, sort of a third perspective. And they came back and they said, you're like a Swiss Army knife of mediocrity, versatile, sure, but not particularly sharp at anything. I mean, how many senior and director titles do you need before you need to collect before you realize you're building a scrapbook, not a career path? Let's talk about your relentless need to list every single conference you've ever attended. We get it, Matt. You're a conference groupie. You're 2 coffee stamps away from getting your own lanyard laminated. And, again, this is, put into the system as a, sarcastic, maybe overly cruel way of looking at our resumes. But again, I'll take Matt, and this isn't picking on Matt by any means whatsoever. He's somebody who, lives in an area that's, not the center of Silicon Valley, right? He chose many years ago to take an opportunity to work over in Australia, right? Go see the world. Was he, does LinkedIn take that into consideration and give great credence to it? No, it looks at it as, oh, you're far away. So how are you going to represent yourself in the system? In fact, there's actually a little piece in here that says, oh, and reliable remote worker, flexing about how working in your PJs isn't the flex you think it is. But hey, congratulations on being the world's most overqualified Zoom participant. And again, this is, I think, a great example of, not a knock on Matt by any means, but, Matt has to represent himself. He works with a number of companies, who works for a number of interesting companies. We've had a number of his companies on the podcast before. We've had Matt on the podcast before, but he works remote. And, he needed to come up with ways to, use words, use descriptive language to describe what he did. And in his case, he works remote from Silicon Valley, or remote from the United States, or remote from a lot of things because he's in Australia. Reliable remote worker. That seems like a pretty good thing, especially if you're like, hey, we're considering somebody of his technical depth, but how do you represent that you're going to be really good at being, remote to a team that might be in lots of different places? So again, I only bring this up because, as I was having some fun with the thing, and again, I hope nobody takes this as, we should use this sarcastic thing to, represent our peers. But it was, again, sort of interesting for me that as I was looking at it, I was looking at mine originally and sort of going, maybe there is some truth to, the kind of the BS level that might be in my LinkedIn resume itself. But as I was looking at other people that I have a lot of respect for, that I know have done some very interesting things that companies have felt was valuable, there is a perception that sometimes if you're not the lead dog in the whole company and you do everything, that you're just a cog in the machine. And I think by no means have we ever really thought that. But I know there's people that can kind of get that perception, right? You hear the word or the term imposter syndrome all the time kicked around. And I think it comes from the fact that in our industry, we place so much sort of adulation and spotlight on the person running the company, and we place so little on the number of people that support it, that make it possible, that make the technology possible, that make the market awareness possible, that make the implementations possible. And it feels like a weird imbalance because, if we're perfectly honest, Sam Altman's going to get awarded $10 billion worth of equity. Did he deserve that? Maybe he did. But also, the 4 leading people in his company all quit. Is anybody questioning if he's a bad leader? Well, not yet. But, he also got fired by his company last year. He also, brings into question, what are you guys doing? Where are you going with all these things, right? But we write so many articles that are glowing about what an incredible, visionary person he is, and you could replace him with lots of other people in the tech industry. But we tend to joke about and sort of, I don't want to say belittle, but sort of, play down the hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people that are doing things below that level. And it's interesting. I think it's important to be able to sort of laugh at yourself and, look at yourself in a certain light. And me looking at the roasting thing was sort of fun to do. It did sort of make me think, hey, am I being too flowery? Do I have too much BS in my own title? And, why do I go about doing that? Is that something I should stop doing? But it did also get me thinking, like, do I need to be more aware, be more respectful, be more conscious about all the people doing all the things that make, the top person look as good as they do, that they're able to get results that they get. So anyways, sort of a long-winded bouncing back and forth between sort of the hero culture and the imposter syndrome culture and stuff that we have within tech, and whether or not it's justified or not. But anyways, getting back to the important things, Aaron and I are going to be trying to do whatever we can to try and help some folks out here locally for us. I know lots of people go through things that happen local to them. And I hope, if you have a difficult situation that happens around you, that you're able to, spend some time, whether it's weather related or whether it's, economic related or just, something that happens in your community that you can help out. Hopefully you do. And if there's things that Aaron and I can do to help you with, let us know, because we're reaching out to you a little bit on this situation. So anyways, hope everybody's doing well. Hopefully, the things for folks that have been affected by this storm or some other storm that come along, get resolved faster than they may be planned to do. We'll be keeping an eye on it. But anyways, hopefully everybody's doing well. Hopefully everybody is getting ready for Q4. I know Q4 for a lot of people, quarter 4 of the financial year is always hectic and busy. I know sometimes events come along. I know there's travel, there's holidays. It can be stressful, but hopefully you get a chance to take a breath and enjoy it, because, it's a fun time of the year. Fall happens, the holidays happen, families come together. And so we're looking forward to that. So anyways, thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend about the show. Thanks for giving us some of your time as always. And with that, we'll wrap it up and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.